In this episode, we begin looking at one of the most useful ways organizations bring order and consistency to the protection of information assets. Information asset security frameworks, standards, and guidelines may sound formal at first, but they exist for a very practical reason. They help organizations make better security decisions without inventing everything from scratch every time a new risk, system, or business need appears. For a brand new learner, this topic matters because security can feel overwhelming when it is seen only as a long list of threats and controls. These structured approaches give organizations a way to organize responsibilities, define expectations, reduce guesswork, and create a shared understanding of what good protection should look like. Once you understand what frameworks, standards, and guidelines actually do, the subject becomes much less abstract and much more connected to daily decisions about information, systems, access, and risk. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyberauthor.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. A good place to start is by separating the three terms in the title because they are related but they are not identical. A framework is a broad structure that helps an organization think about security in an organized way, usually by grouping important ideas such as governance, risk, control selection, monitoring, and improvement into a coherent model. A standard is more specific and usually sets a defined requirement or expected level of consistency, which means it tells people what must or should be in place for a certain area. A guideline is usually more flexible and advisory, offering recommended ways to approach a task or decision without always carrying the same level of obligation as a standard. Beginners often blend these together and assume they all mean a generic set of rules, but that causes confusion. The real value comes from seeing how they work together, because a framework provides structure, a standard provides consistency, and a guideline provides helpful direction for applying security in real situations. These approaches matter because protecting information assets is too important and too complex to depend only on memory, habit, or individual opinion. Organizations handle customer records, employee data, financial information, contracts, system configurations, intellectual property, and many other assets that can be exposed, altered, lost, or misused if security decisions are weak or inconsistent. Without a structured approach, one department may secure data carefully while another handles similar information casually, and that inconsistency creates risk. Frameworks, standards, and guidelines help reduce that problem by creating common language and common expectations across the organization. They also make it easier for leaders, technical teams, auditors, and business managers to talk about security using shared concepts instead of isolated assumptions. For a beginner, the big idea is that these tools do not exist to create unnecessary bureaucracy. They exist to help organizations protect information in a repeatable, understandable, and defensible way. Another reason they are so important is that information asset protection is not a one-person job and not a one-team job. Security touches leadership, human resources, HR, operations, legal review, vendor management, facilities, application teams, network teams, and ordinary employees who handle information every day. A framework helps those groups see how their responsibilities fit into the larger security picture instead of acting as if protection belongs only to a dedicated security department. Standards make it easier for those groups to apply the same expectations when approving access, retaining records, securing devices, or handling sensitive information. Guidelines help people translate those expectations into practical day-to-day behavior. This matters because organizations become inconsistent when security depends too heavily on personal interpretation. Structured approaches reduce that inconsistency by making protection less dependent on who happens to be making the decision at a given moment and more dependent on an agreed organizational model. It also helps to understand that these structures are closely tied to governance and risk rather than standing apart from them. Information asset protection should reflect what the organization values most, what kinds of harm it is trying to avoid, and how much risk leaders are willing to tolerate in different situations. A good framework supports that by connecting security work to business priorities instead of treating every asset or every threat as equally urgent. Standards then help express those priorities in a more concrete way, such as requiring stronger controls for highly sensitive data or more disciplined review of privileged access. Guidelines help employees and managers apply those expectations sensibly when real-life situations do not fit neatly into one simple rule. For someone new to this area, it is important to see that frameworks, standards, and guidelines are not just documents sitting beside the security program. In many ways, they are the structure that helps the security program act consistently and remain aligned with organizational purpose. A strong framework also helps the organization think in layers, which is essential because information asset protection cannot be reduced to one control or one technology. Information assets need classification, access control, secure handling, retention decisions, physical protection, monitoring, backup, recovery planning, and ongoing review. If these activities are handled separately without a common structure, the result is often fragmented control design where some areas receive heavy attention and others are neglected. A framework helps prevent that fragmentation by showing how different control areas support one another. For example, identity management affects access control affects confidentiality, classification affects handling requirements, and monitoring helps reveal whether the whole arrangement is working as intended. A beginner should notice that the framework is valuable not because it contains magic answers, but because it helps people think in a connected way. That connected view is what allows security work to become more systematic and less reactive. Standards become especially useful when the organization needs a clear baseline for what acceptable protection looks like. A baseline matters because without one, teams often make inconsistent choices about password strength, account reviews, backup protection, encryption, logging, vendor oversight, or data retention. One manager may demand tight controls while another accepts weaker practices simply because expectations were never clearly stated. Standards help correct that by defining common requirements so that similar risks are handled with similar discipline across the organization. They do not eliminate judgment, but they reduce avoidable variation. This is valuable from both an operational and an audit perspective because it becomes easier to measure whether controls are present and whether different parts of the organization are protecting information in a reasonably consistent manner. For a learner, the key lesson is that standards bring clarity. They help answer the question of what the organization expects to be true when it says an information asset is being protected appropriately. Guidelines serve a different but equally important purpose because real life is full of situations where people need direction without rigid instructions that fit every case poorly. A guideline may explain recommended ways to classify records, handle portable media, respond to unusual access needs, or protect information during remote work, even if it does not function as an absolute requirement in every circumstance. This flexibility makes guidelines helpful where judgment still matters or where the environment changes too quickly for highly rigid rules to stay useful. Beginners sometimes think guidelines are weak simply because they are less strict than standards, but that misses their real value. Good guidelines make it easier for people to apply sound security thinking in the messy situations where a short rule alone is not enough. They support better decisions by providing context, examples, and preferred approaches, which helps people act consistently without assuming every situation can be governed by one hard requirement. One of the most important ideas in this topic is that these approaches should be risk-based rather than copied blindly. A framework may be widely respected, and a standard may be well-written, but an organization still has to apply them in a way that fits its size, mission, industry, legal obligations, and threat environment. A hospital, a university, a bank, and a manufacturing company may all need strong information protection, yet they will not all face the same risks or protect the same types of assets in the same way. This is why mature organizations adapt structured approaches thoughtfully instead of using them as decorative labels. The goal is not to say that a certain framework name appears in a policy. The goal is to use the framework to improve real protection decisions. For a beginner, that is a healthy way to think about security models in general. They are tools for organizing judgment and reducing risk, not substitutes for judgment or excuses to ignore the actual business environment. This topic also connects directly to the idea of maturity, because frameworks, standards, and guidelines help organizations move from ad hoc behavior toward more dependable control practices. In an immature environment, information security may depend heavily on individual effort, local habits, or reaction to whatever problem happened most recently. In a more mature environment, roles are clearer, expectations are documented, controls are more consistent, and improvement happens through review rather than through repeated crisis. Structured approaches help support that maturity by making security less random and less personality-driven. They create a foundation for training, measurement, accountability, and periodic assessment. A beginner should notice that maturity does not necessarily mean complexity for its own sake. Often it means that the organization has become more disciplined in how it identifies information assets, assigns protection requirements, checks whether controls are working, and updates expectations when business conditions or risks change over time. Some well-known examples can help make the topic feel more concrete, even though the main goal here is understanding the concepts rather than memorizing brand names. An organization might use control objectives for information and related technologies, COBIT, to connect governance, control thinking, and assurance in a structured way. It might look to International Organization for Standardization, ISO, guidance, especially around information security management, to build a more formal approach to policies, controls, and continuous improvement. It may also use National Institute of Standards and Technology, NIST, publications to help think through control selection, risk treatment, and security program structure. The important point is not that one name solves everything. The important point is that respected frameworks and standards give organizations tested structures they can adapt to support information asset protection with more consistency and credibility than a purely improvised approach would provide. These structures are also important because they support communication between different audiences inside the organization. Senior leaders need to understand risk, accountability, and whether security investments align with business priorities. Technical teams need clear expectations for implementation and operation. Business managers need guidance on how information should be handled in the context of their processes and responsibilities. Auditors need a basis for evaluating whether controls are designed well and operating as intended. Frameworks, standards, and guidelines help all of these groups speak to one another more effectively because they create shared reference points. Instead of vague statements that security should be strong, the organization can discuss specific expectations, responsibilities, and control themes in a more structured way. For a beginner, this is important because security problems are often made worse by poor communication. Structured approaches improve protection partly by improving the quality of the conversations that surround protection. Another key benefit is that these approaches support consistency over time, especially when people, systems, and business priorities change. Staff members leave, new technologies are adopted, vendors are added, mergers occur, remote work expands, and regulations shift. Without stable frameworks, standards, and guidelines, security expectations can drift as each change introduces new decisions and new exceptions. A strong structure helps the organization evaluate those changes against a known baseline rather than starting from zero each time. This does not mean the security model becomes frozen. It means change happens in a more controlled way because there is a reference point against which new risks, new assets, and new operating methods can be judged. For someone studying CISA, this matters because it shows why security documentation is not just administrative clutter. When done well, it helps preserve organizational memory and control discipline even when the environment around the organization keeps evolving. Of course, these approaches can also be misunderstood or misused, and beginners should watch for that. One common mistake is treating a framework as if adopting its name automatically creates strong security, when in reality the real question is whether the organization translated that framework into meaningful action. Another mistake is writing standards that are so rigid, unrealistic, or disconnected from actual work that employees constantly work around them. Guidelines can also become ineffective if they are too vague to help people make real decisions. There is also a tendency in some environments to create too many documents without connecting them clearly, which can leave staff confused about what matters most. The lesson here is that frameworks, standards, and guidelines are only valuable when they are understandable, aligned with risk, supported by leadership, and used to drive behavior. Their purpose is not to impress people with volume. Their purpose is to improve protection of information assets in ways people can actually follow. From an audit perspective, information asset security frameworks, standards, and guidelines are valuable because they provide the basis for asking whether the organization's protective controls are coherent, complete, and consistent. An auditor may want to know whether the organization selected an appropriate framework, whether standards reflect business and legal needs, whether guidelines support practical handling of sensitive information, and whether the documented expectations match what people actually do. If a policy says restricted data should have strong access controls, but access reviews are weak, that gap matters. If a framework claims to support risk-based protection, but asset classification is poorly defined, that gap matters too. These documents are not the goal of security, but they do reveal whether the organization has a structured way to express and enforce its protection model. For a learner, this is one of the most useful insights in the whole topic. Security becomes easier to evaluate when there is a clear structure behind it. The main takeaway is that frameworks, standards, and guidelines help organizations protect information assets by turning broad security goals into structured, understandable, and repeatable practices. A framework gives the organization a way to see the whole picture, a standard establishes consistent expectations, and a guideline helps people apply sound judgment in real situations. Together, they reduce confusion, support governance, improve communication, and make information protection more disciplined across changing environments. For a new CISA student, this topic matters because it explains how organizations move from good intentions to organized control. Once you understand that these structured approaches are not just paperwork, but tools for aligning protection with risk, business need, and accountability, you can see why they are such an important part of protecting information assets in a serious and sustainable way.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.